The police lights flashed red and blue against the fading summer haze, cutting across the streets of Willow Creek like blades of fire. A battered Dodge Ram sat idling on the shoulder, its driver calm, silent hands steady on the wheel. Two officers approached with suspicion, their boots striking pavement in sharp rhythm. A crowd began to gather near the diner phones, raised whispers spreading. They thought it was just another traffic stop. But what none of them knew, what even the officers couldn't imagine, was that the quiet man in that worn black t-shirt was no ordinary driver. He was a tomb guard, one of the most disciplined soldiers in the United States Army, and in less than 5 minutes, the military would arrive. Follow my story until the very end, and drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story reaches. The late afternoon sun shimmered on the asphalt, warping the air above Main Street into wavering waves of heat. The scent of freshly cut grass and the greasy comfort of Parker's Grill burgers mingled together, forming the smell of small-town summer. Sergeant Caleb Marshall sat behind the wheel of his truck, jaw clenched but face unreadable. He had spent hours earlier that day marching in the precise, deliberate rhythm demanded at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Each step of that sacred duty was etched into his muscles, each breath regulated by discipline. Now, off-duty, dressed only in jeans and a plain black t-shirt, he seemed invisible, just another working-class man in an old truck. The cruiser pulled in behind him with a squeal of brakes, its lights still flashing. Officer Emily Carter, 29, stepped out first. Her mirrored sunglasses caught the sun, turning her gaze into a hard reflection that revealed nothing. Her ponytail was tight, every strand in place. Authority clung to her shoulders as she marched toward the driver's window. Her partner, Officer Michael Hayes, followed a step behind. He was older, 34, broader around the waist, less rigid. His hand rested on his duty belt in a way that said caution, not aggression. Emily leaned in at Caleb's open window, her voice clipped. "Afternoon, sir. You were going a bit fast back there." "License and registration." Caleb met her gaze. His own eyes calm, steady, the kind of gaze trained not to flinch. "I was doing the speed limit, officer," he replied evenly. "But here you go." He reached into his back pocket, drew out his wallet, and carefully handed over both license and registration. His movements were deliberate, slow, respectful, the kind of care drilled into him from years of inspections and ceremony. Emily flipped the documents open, squinting. "Caleb Marshall, huh? This truck of yours looks like it's held together with duct tape. You sure it's roadworthy?" A faint murmur rippled through the crowd, forming across the street. A couple of teenagers laughed quietly. Their phones angled to catch every word. Caleb's lips pressed into a straight line, but he answered without hesitation. "It passes inspection every year, maintained well enough to get me where I need to go." Emily raised a brow, unimpressed. She tapped the corner of his license with one polished fingernail. "Uh-huh. Step out of the vehicle, please. We need to take a closer look." Michael shifted uneasy. His tone softened. "Just routine, man. Won't take long." Inside, Caleb's pulse stayed steady, the same rhythm he had learned pacing 21 steps before turning with a flawless salute at Arlington. He nodded once, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stepped out. His boots hit the pavement with a heavy thud that carried the weight of discipline. Emily circled the truck, her eyes scanning its rusted edges as though hunting for guilt hidden in metal. Michael stood closer to Caleb, glancing nervously at the growing crowd. A woman across the street whispered, "Looks like trouble." Another man muttered, "That truck's an eyesore, bet he's up to no good." Caleb heard it all but gave no reaction. Years of silence before crowds at the tomb had taught him to endure scrutiny without flinching. Emily stopped at the tailgate, rapped it twice with her knuckles. "This thing's more rust than steel. Tell me, what do you do for a living, Mr. Marshall?" Driving around in a heap like this doesn't exactly scream steady income. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. His voice controlled. "I serve in the Army, officer, stationed at Fort Myer." Emily smirked, brushing a speck of dust from her sleeve as if dismissing his words. "Army, huh? What, like a desk job? You don't look like you're in uniform." "I'm off duty," Caleb said simply, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his posture straight, not just military straight, but tomb guard straight. Michael glanced at his partner, a hint of warning in his eyes. "Come on, Em," he murmured. "Guy's got his papers in order. Let's wrap it up." But Emily ignored him. She stepped closer to Caleb, her voice sharp. You were weaving a bit. Been drinking? Or maybe distracted? Either way, I don't think you should be driving. Caleb's jaw tightened. He inhaled once, controlled. I haven't been drinking. I was driving straight. If you've got a citation, write it. Otherwise, I'd like to go home. The crowd murmured louder. Some shook their heads. Others smirked, enjoying the spectacle. Emily's face flushed at his calm defiance. Don't get smart with me. Hands on the truck. We're doing a pat-down. A ripple of tension shot through the onlookers. Phones rose higher, recording every second. A young woman whispered to her friend, "This is ridiculous." Caleb turned without complaint, placing his palms on the truck bed. The cool metal burned under the heat of the sun. He stood silently as Emily's hand swept over him. When she reached his back pocket, her fingers paused. She pulled out the wallet, flipped it open, and her eyes caught a small silver badge. The insignia gleamed faintly in the light, two crossed rifles encircled by a wreath. Emily frowned. What's this? Some kind of souvenir? Caleb's voice came low, steady, like a drumbeat. It's not a souvenir. It's my badge. Emily snorted, tossing the wallet back. Yeah, right. Michael shifted uncomfortably. But Emily was already striding back toward the cruiser documents in hand. Caleb stood by the truck posture unbroken as the crowd's whispers grew heavier. Across the street behind the wide diner window, Linda Parker froze mid-wipe with her apron. She had known Caleb for years, coffee after his shifts. Quiet nods, the kind of respect that didn't need words. She knew the way he stood, the way he carried that badge. And now her chest tightened as she watched him surrounded, misunderstood. She reached for the phone with trembling hands, dialing Fort Myer. This is Linda Parker at Parker's Grill, she said, voice urgent. One of your tomb guards is being hassled by the police. His name's Caleb Marshall. You need to send someone. Now. On the street, Caleb's eyes fixed on the horizon, his breathing steady, his silence heavy. The moment before a storm. Emily Carter returned from the cruiser with a sharpness in her step, her sunglasses sliding lower down her nose, as though impatience itself pressed them there. She clutched Caleb's license in one hand, a crease forming between her brows. All right, Mr. Marshall, she announced, her tone deliberately louder than before so the crowd could hear. Your record's clean, but I'm not convinced you're fit to drive this vehicle. Caleb's voice came calm steel wrapped in velvet. On what grounds, officer? I've complied with everything you asked. I haven't broken any laws. Emily shifted her weight, one hand settling on her holster, not out of necessity, but authority. You're coming with us. Station, sobriety test. The crowd murmured in disapproval. A woman with a stroller shook her head. A man leaned to his friend, whispering, He looks steady to me. She's pushing it. Caleb didn't flinch. His hands remained still at his sides, body poised like stone carved by patience. If you have a citation, write it. Otherwise, I'll be on my way. Michael Hayes exhaled audibly, tugging at the strap across his vest. Emily, maybe, but she cut him off. He's being uncooperative. That's enough for me. She turned her voice toward Caleb again, sharper. Turn around, hands behind your back. You're under arrest for obstructing an officer. The words cracked across the summer air like thunder. Phones lifted higher. A teenager in a baseball cap hissed under his breath. Oh, this is going to blow up on TikTok. Caleb drew in one slow breath. He remembered the endless hours of guard duty when rain would soak his uniform to the bone, when lightning split the sky above the marble tomb, and he was commanded by honor itself not to flinch. The discipline wasn't for show. It was for moments like this when injustice pressed down and patience was the only shield. I am not obstructing you, officer, he said softly. I am standing here answering your questions. Arresting me for that would be your mistake. Emily's cheeks flushed crimson. She stepped closer, shadows cutting across her face. You don't get to lecture me on mistakes. Michael reached out his hand, brushing her sleeve. Emily, enough. You're pushing this too far. She shook him off, jaw clenched. The weight of the crowd's gaze pressed on her, and instead of backing down, she leaned into defiance. Don't interfere, Mike. Across the street, Linda Parker stood frozen in the diner doorway, phone pressed to her ear. She had already delivered the urgent message. Already heard the clipped voice on the other end promise, We're sending someone immediately. Now she could only watch the tension boil. Emily advanced, cuffs in hand, her shadow falling over Caleb. The air around them grew heavy, as though the whole street held its breath. Caleb's eyes met hers without fear. And then it came the sound. A deep, low rumble, at first faint beneath the hum of conversation, then louder. Engines multiple grinding forward with authority. Dust plumed at the end of Main Street. Heads turned. A teenager gasped. "What is that?" The rumble became a roar. Two olive-drab Humvees rolled into view, their tires chewing the pavement, sunlight glinting off armored glass. They pulled up in a clean, precise line, dust swirling around them like a veil torn open. The crowd fell silent. Doors swung open in unison, metal clanging. 8 soldiers emerged, their uniforms, crisp movements synchronized like a single body. They stepped onto the pavement with the quiet thunder of boots that had marched over fields of history. At their center strode Captain Laura Bennett, her blonde hair tucked under her cap, eyes like sharpened glass. Every step was purposeful, each one cutting through the tension. Emily froze, mid-motion, cuffs half raised. Michael's hand dropped from his belt. The crowd's phones jerked upward, recording feverishly now. Bennett stopped 3 feet from Caleb. Her voice carried authority wrapped in ice. "Sergeant Marshall." The words sliced the silence. She snapped a crisp salute, hand flat motion, flawless. The crowd erupted in whispers. "Sergeant..." "What?" Caleb straightened instinctively, his face still calm but eyes flickering with recognition. He returned the salute, precise, silent. "I was informed of a situation," Bennett said. "Are you all right?" Sergeant Emily's mouth fell open. Her grip slackened on the cuffs, sunglasses sliding further down. "Sir Sergeant." Michael stumbled back a step, his boots scuffing against the curb. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. The crowd gasped, murmuring in disbelief. One man whispered reverently, "A tomb guard." Caleb's voice was steady. "I'm fine, Captain. Just a misunderstanding." Bennett's gaze slid from him to Emily, narrowing like a blade being drawn. "And who is in charge here?" Emily swallowed hard. Her throat bobbed, her voice cracking as she forced words out. I am, ma'am. Officer Emily Carter. Willow Creek PD. We stopped this man for a routine check. He was uncooperative. Bennett's silence was worse than shouting. She stepped closer, her shadow engulfing Emily. Her voice was colder than steel. "This man," she said, her words deliberate, "is Sergeant Caleb Marshall, a tomb guard of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, one of the most disciplined soldiers in the United States Army, entrusted with guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier. And you thought it was appropriate to threaten him with arrest." Emily paled. Her hand trembled, cuffs slipping back into their pouch. I didn't know he." Bennett cut her off with a sharp gesture. "You didn't ask. You saw a man in an old truck and decided he was a problem. Do you have any idea what it takes to earn this?" She pointed to the badge now resting in Caleb's hand, silver, gleaming against the sunlight. 9 months of training, countless hours in silence, perfect discipline, absolute dedication. The crowd listened in stunned reverence. The young woman filming whispered, "That's incredible." An older man muttered, "I should have known. The way he stood, he had that look." Michael's voice wavered. "Ma'am, we didn't mean any disrespect. We were just doing our job." Bennett's eyes softened a fraction, but her tone remained iron. "Your job is to protect and serve, not harass a soldier who has done more for this country than most ever will." Emily's lips trembled. For the first time that day, her confidence cracked into raw shame. Caleb's voice broke the silence, deep and calm. "Captain, I don't want trouble. I just want to go home." Bennett nodded once, but her gaze never left Emily. "Understood, Sergeant, but this will be addressed." Then she turned back, her voice carrying command. "Officer Carter, you owe this man an apology." For a long second, Officer Emily Carter didn't move. Her mirrored sunglasses reflected the captain's stern expression, but behind them her eyes darted, torn between pride and humiliation. The silence weighed heavy, broken only by the steady thrum of the Humvees idling nearby and the faint murmur of the crowd. The cuffs she had nearly slapped onto Caleb's wrists now felt like burning iron against her hip. She had strutted into this stop certain of control, certain that her badge gave her the right to press to push to command. But now, standing beneath the piercing gaze of Captain Laura Bennett, she felt exposed. Michael Hayes, sensing her hesitation, spoke up quietly, his voice almost pleading. "Emily, just do it." The words barely carried past the crowd, but they hit her like a hammer. She swallowed hard. Her lips parted, closed, parted again. Finally, with one trembling hand, she tugged her sunglasses free, revealing eyes rimmed with heat and frustration. She forced herself to look at Caleb, at the man she had mocked for driving an old truck, the man she had nearly cuffed in front of the whole town. Her voice cracked on the first word. "Sergeant Marshall, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I judged you without cause. I should have asked, not assumed." The apology wasn't smooth. It wasn't polished. But it was real. And the crowd sensed it. Some of them nodded quietly. A few lowered their phones. Caleb studied her for a moment. His face remained steady, unreadable, the same composure he had shown all along. Then he gave a single nod. "Apology accepted, officer. But next time remember, ask before you judge. You never know who you're dealing with." The words sank deeper than any reprimand. Michael stepped forward, his hand rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. His voice was thick with regret. "Sergeant, I'm sorry too. I should have spoken up sooner. I saw what was happening, and I let it slide. That's on me." Caleb gave him the faintest of smiles, small but genuine. "No harm done. You were doing your job. Just remember what that job is really for." The tension that had gripped the street began to loosen. The murmurs shifted from outrage to respect-awe. The young woman who had been recording whispered, "That's a tomb guard." "Wow." An older man with grease-stained hands muttered, "Should have known." The way he stood, like a wall. Linda Parker finally stepped out of the diner apron, still dusted with flour, her silver hair catching the light. She clapped her hands together sharply, her voice carrying across the asphalt. "All right, folks, show's over. Nothing more to see here. Come on back inside, coffee's still hot." The authority in her voice, gentler than the officers, but somehow firmer, began to scatter the crowd. People drifted away in twos and threes, phones slipping into pockets, conversations turning to hushed awe. Captain Bennett turned back to Caleb, her expression softening just slightly. "Sergeant, do you need an escort?" Caleb shook his head. "No, Captain. I'm good. Thank you for coming." Bennett nodded. Her eyes, usually hard steel, held a flicker of warmth. "We've always got your back, Sergeant. Always." At her subtle gesture, the soldiers stepped aside in unison, forming a corridor of respect. The sight drew a gasp from the last lingering bystanders. Caleb walked forward, his boots steady on the pavement, passing between the rigid rows of uniforms. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and the familiar rumble filled the silence. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled away the Dodge Ram fading down Main Street as the Humvees stood at rest guardians of a guardian. The moment etched itself into memory, one of those scenes the town would never forget. Later that evening, the hum of conversation filled Parker's grill once more. The diner smelled of coffee and fried onions just as it always did, but something was different in the air. Respect lingered like an invisible scent born of what they had all witnessed. Caleb sat in his usual corner booth, a cup of black coffee in front of him. He had tried to drive straight home, but Linda had insisted firmly, the way only she could, that he come inside, sit and breathe for a while. Across from him sat Emily and Michael Badges, catching the fluorescent glow of the diner lights. The scene felt strange, almost surreal. Two officers who had nearly cuffed him hours before now, sitting across the table like chastened students. Linda poured their coffees, setting the mugs down with a practiced hand. "You all sorted this out yet?" she asked, her tone warm but firm, like a teacher making sure homework was finished. Caleb lifted his mug, took a long sip. The bitterness grounded him familiar. He let a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Getting there." Emily leaned forward, her elbows braced on the table, her voice softer than anyone had yet heard it. "Sergeant Marshall, can I ask you something?" He nodded. "What's it like? Being a tomb guard?" The question hung in the air. Michael leaned closer, curiosity plain in his expression. Even Linda, though she had heard him speak before, tilted her head to listen. Caleb set his cup down carefully, his gaze going distant, his voice carrying a weight that filled the booth. It's not about me, he said. It's about the unknown soldiers, those who gave everything and got no name in return. Every step I take, every salute, it's for them. You train for 9 months. You memorize 35 pages of history. You polish your uniform until you can see your reflection in every button. And still you're never good enough. You just keep trying to be. His voice quieted, but the silence that followed was louder than noise. Michael blinked, astonished. That's intense. I had no idea. Emily looked down into her coffee, her reflection rippling in the dark liquid. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I became a cop to help people. But today, I didn't do that. I judged you before I knew you. Why didn't you say something? Why not just tell us who you were? Caleb's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. He shook his head once. My badge speaks for itself. If I have to explain it, then I'm not doing my job right. Linda chuckled softly, leaning against the counter with folded arms. That's Caleb for you, never one for bragging. Been coming here for years, and I only found out what he did because I caught a glimpse of that badge one morning. He wouldn't have said a word otherwise. Emily lifted her eyes, meeting Caleb's steady gaze. Something shifted in her expression, the rigidity cracking, replaced by something raw, understanding. I'm going to do better, she whispered. I promise. Caleb studied her for a moment, then gave a single nod. His voice was steady, certain. That's all any of us can do. Keep learning. Keep improving. The hum of the diner wrapped around them, and for the first time since the flashing lights had pierced the summer haze, peace settled over the small town. But the story was not finished. Tomorrow would bring new reckonings, conversations between Captain Bennett and Sheriff Reynolds, decisions about how Willow Creek's officers would be trained. Change was already in motion. And Caleb, quiet as ever, would continue to walk with the same discipline, the same silence, carrying the stories of the nameless on his shoulders. Morning settled over Willow Creek with a pale, forgiving light, as if the town itself wanted to smooth yesterday's rough edges. But quiet did not erase the echo of red and blue, or the way soldiers carved a corridor through dust for a man who never asked for applause. Caleb woke before dawn out of habit. Discipline wasn't a switch. It was a river. He brewed coffee in the dim kitchen, then stood at the sink and let the steam touch his face. It grounded him. It reminded him of Fort Myer mornings, the dew on the drill field, the soft scrape of leather as boots broke silence. He cleaned his boots by the window while the sun climbed. Brush, rag, slow circles. Not because anyone would inspect them here, because ritual steadied what feeling could not. At the tomb, precision was a promise. 21 steps, pivot, 21 seconds, turn, salute, repeat. The sequence lived in his bones. With time, it became prayer. Across town, Officer Emily Carter stared at her bathroom mirror and didn't like what looked back. Pride had always fit like armor. Last night it felt like weight. She had apologized. The words were true. But Captain Bennett's voice still rang. You didn't ask. You saw a man and decided. She splashed water on her face, dried it, put the sunglasses away. She thumbed a message to Michael. You free before shift, need to talk. Yeah. Parker's at 8. See you there. At Fort Myer. Captain Laura Bennett was already in motion. She had a 0900 with Sheriff Tom Reynolds and intended to leave him with more than a handshake. Her office looked over a slice of parade field so green it seemed painted. A squad moved across it with measured certainty. Yesterday, a line had been crossed. Today, she would draw a better one. Reynolds arrived with the weight of a man who had seen too many Friday nights and Monday mornings. He took off his hat, nodded sat. Sheriff Bennett said straight to it, What happened yesterday can't happen again. He nodded. I know. She slid a folder across the desk overview of the tomb history of the unknowns, a training agenda. I want your officers to understand what that badge means before they mistake it for a novelty again. He slowed over the photo sentinels in rain, in midnight, in glare, never flinching. That's a hell of a standard. It is, Bennett said. It isn't for show. It is for the living who grieve and the dead who can't speak. Respect is not optional. For any uniform. Reynolds folded the folder like a man handling a flag. I've spoken to Carter and Hayes. They know they messed up. We'll cooperate. Tell me what you need. I need your people here, Bennett said. One day. Morning on history and standards, afternoon on the plaza. I want them to feel marble under their boots. They'll come, he said. I'll be there. He hesitated. Carter should speak too, not to excuse, to own it. Good, Bennett said. Sergeant Marshall. He wants no spotlight. Then we'll let him. They stood. They shook hands. It felt like a compact. Parker's grill woke with the town. The bell jingled as Michael walked in. Emily was already at a corner table, sunglasses absent. Linda set down 2 mugs without asking. You okay? Michael asked. No, Emily said. But I will be. We're called to the station. Sheriff wants everyone at Fort Myer next week. Training. I figured, she said. I want to speak. To apologize again? To tell the truth, she said. Authority became a shortcut. I thought the badge made me right, not responsible. I should have stopped you, he said. You tried? She said gently. Next time, push harder. Linda topped off their cups. Humility's a better uniform than polyester, she said, and tilted her head toward the window. He's outside. They turned. Caleb stood on the sidewalk, coffee in one hand, paper bag in the other, talking to an older man about spark plugs, as if yesterday were a rumor. Nothing in his posture asked for deference. Everything about it invited calm. Emily stood so quickly the table juddered. She stepped outside. Morning air held a cool edge. Caleb turned when he heard the door. Sergeant, she began then. Caleb. Officer, he said. Emily, she corrected. Thank you for accepting my apology. I know you didn't need to. I know you didn't want any of this. Neither did you, he said. I did, actually, she said. I wanted control more than understanding. That's what I have to fix. Sheriff's sending us for training. I heard, he said. Captain Bennett moves quickly. She does. I'm going to speak there. Not to center myself, to make sure I don't forget. Memory is a discipline, he said. Will you be there if the captain asks? If not, I'll be where I'm supposed to be. And where's that on the marble, he said, where silence does more work than words. The training day came sooner than expected. 3 patrol cars rolled through Fort Myer just after 8. Willow Creek uniforms, crisp faces tight. Sheriff Reynolds led from the front. Emily walked beside him, sunglasses left behind. Michael followed with the first group hands empty, no clipboard, no excuses. Bennett met them at the auditorium. The morning was history, photographs, film, lineage of sacrifice. An NCO with a voice like gravel told them about night shifts and hurricanes, about thunder cracking over marble and sentinels who didn't break stride. After lunch, silent out of respect, they walked to the cemetery. The air felt cooler among the trees, as if shade were a ceremony. Stone opened in every direction, names and not names catching the light. On the plaza, footsteps softened. Conversation fell to nothing. The sentinel traced the familiar path, heel plates ringing like a metronome. 21 steps. Halt. Turn. 21 seconds. The precision didn't perform. It testified. Emily felt something rise into her throat and stop there. She had never been good with silence. Here silence filled her instead. She watched stillness and understood that restraint is a kind of strength. When the relief came and the guard change began, Bennett leaned toward the sheriff. After your officer can speak. They waited. The ritual completed. Then they moved to a small cleared space where tourists wouldn't stumble into their circle. The officers formed a rough semicircle. Bennett gave Emily a nod. Emily looked at the ground, then up. No notes. I was wrong, she said, steady but soft. I judged a man because it was easy. I used authority as a shortcut to the truth. It isn't. Authority is responsibility to see more, not less. She swallowed. I thought uniforms made us different from the people we stop. Standing here, I understand uniform means service, not superiority. I didn't understand that yesterday. I intend to understand it tomorrow. No one applauded. The wrong sound. But something in the group loosened like a knot, easing after a long pull. Beyond the trees, the sentinel turned again and began his measured count. Caleb was not part of the circle. He moved like a shadow at its edge on his way to a locker, then to a mirror where he would check each button ribbon seam. He didn't linger to be seen. He wasn't the point. He was the proof. On the walk back, Michael fell in beside Emily. You spoke well, he said. I spoke honestly, she replied. Now I have to live like it. Harder part. It always is. That evening, light over Arlington softened to gold. Families drifted through the rows, voices low. Caleb stepped onto the plaza for his shift uniform perfect. He took his first 21 steps, each one a promise. From a distance, Emily watched a moment longer than she meant to. She wasn't searching for recognition. She was learning a new way to see. In Willow Creek, Linda flipped the closed sign at Parker's, wiped the last table, and stood in the doorway. She thought how quickly a town can change when one person chooses humility over thunder. She smiled, turned off the lights, and let the bell ring once one small, clear note in a day full of quiet. The next morning broke with a softness that disguised the storm brewing beneath the surface of Willow Creek. To anyone driving down Main Street, it looked like an ordinary day. The bakery was already open, its sweet scent drifting past the post office. The newspaper boy tossed folded bundles onto porches with careless arcs. But to the officers of Willow Creek PD, yesterday's spectacle wasn't fading, it was sharpening. Sheriff Tom Reynolds called for a mandatory briefing in the small wood-paneled room at the back of the station. The blinds were drawn, though sunlight still pierced the edges, casting long blades of light across the floor. The room was packed. Every officer from the department squeezed into plastic chairs, badges glinting faintly under the fluorescent hum. Emily Carter sat near the front, her notebook open, pen poised, though her fingers trembled slightly. Reynolds stood at the podium, his broad shoulders filling his uniform with the weariness of 20 years on the force. He scanned the room slowly before he spoke. "You all saw the footage." He began, his voice gravelly. "Some of you were there. Others have heard by now. Our department stopped a man who turned out to be Sergeant Caleb Marshall Tombguard, United States Army. What happened next is going to follow this town for a long time." A low murmur rippled through the room. Some officers shifted uneasily. Others crossed their arms defensively. Reynolds held up a hand. Silence. "I won't mince words. We embarrassed ourselves. Not just one officer, not just the two who made the stop. All of us, because the public doesn't see a single badge. They see every badge." Emily's throat tightened. She felt every pair of eyes flicker her way, though Reynolds didn't name her. Michael sat beside her, jaw clenched, staring at the floor. Reynolds continued, "That's why starting today, this department is changing protocol. We're partnering with Fort Myer. Every officer in this room will undergo training. You will learn what it means to serve beyond the badge you wear. You'll learn the history, the discipline, the sacrifice." He paused, his voice gaining weight. "And you'll learn respect." One officer in the back, younger, shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff, with all due respect, this was one bad stop. We can't be expected to know every soldier that walks through town." Reynolds' eyes snapped to him. "No, you can't. But you can be expected to treat every person you stop with dignity, badge or no badge, uniform or no uniform. That is the standard. And if you can't meet it, you don't belong here." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that burned. Emily's pen hovered over her notebook, but she didn't write. Instead, she raised her hand. Reynolds nodded at her. "Sheriff?" She began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'd like to say something." A rustle of surprise moved through the room. Emily Carter, usually the sharp edge in any room, was not known for humility. She stood slowly facing her colleagues. Her cheeks felt hot, but her voice didn't waver. "Last week, she said, I stopped a man. I saw an old truck, worn clothes, and I assumed the worst. I disrespected someone who deserved better, a soldier, yes, but more than that, a man who carried himself with honor. I couldn't see past my own bias." Her eyes dropped for a moment before rising again. "That day taught me something. Every stop we make is a choice, a chance to escalate or de-escalate, a chance to judge or to listen. I chose wrong. I judged, and I was wrong." The room was still. No phones buzzed, no pens scratched. Even the fluorescent hum seemed muted. Emily pressed on. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I will not hide behind excuses. I learned something about dignity that day, and I will not forget it. Every time I wear this badge from now on, I'll remember that respect is the first duty. Without it, we serve no one." Her words landed like stones into still water, rippling outward. Michael shifted in his seat, then stood beside her. His voice was quieter but clear. "She's right. I let it happen. I stood by because it was easier. That's not who I want to be. I'm owning that, and I'm changing. Reynolds nodded once his eyes steady. That's what I needed to hear, from both of you. Because this department doesn't need perfect officers, it needs accountable ones. The briefing ended in silence, not applause. Silence that meant reflection. By the afternoon, word had spread. Willow Creek was small. News traveled faster than coffee cooled. At the diner, locals murmured about the training about Emily's speech. Linda Parker, always at the center of small-town currents, poured coffee with her ears sharp. When Caleb stepped through the door, a hush fell. He wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a plain shirt, but the weight of recognition followed him now. Linda offered her warmest smile. Coffee, same as always. He nodded, sliding into his corner booth. Moments later, Emily appeared at the doorway. For the first time in years, she entered without the armor of sunglasses. She spotted him, hesitated, then crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps. Sergeant, she said softly. Caleb, he corrected. Caleb, she echoed. She swallowed, then gestured toward the seat opposite him. Mind if I sit? He nodded once. She slid into the booth, her hands folded tightly around each other. I spoke at the station today, she admitted. Told them the truth. I don't know what it'll change, but it's a start. Caleb studied her, his face unreadable. A start is all anyone can do. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I'm not asking for your forgiveness again. I just wanted you to know. Linda set down 2 steaming mugs, glancing between them with the faintest smile. Caleb took his lifting it carefully. Then you've said what needed saying. The rest will be in what you do. Emily nodded slowly, the weight lifting just enough for her shoulders to ease. The diner buzzed softly around them, but at that booth, silence held more meaning than noise. That evening, Captain Bennett sat in her office writing the final line of her report. She paused, pen hovering, then underlined one word, respect. She set the paper aside, staring out the window as the last light faded from the parade field. At that same hour, Caleb stood in his yard, wiping down the hood of his truck. The Dodge Ram still bore its rust, still carried its dents, but it rumbled steady. Neighbors passed, some offering nods of acknowledgement, others a quiet salute. Caleb returned each gesture with the same steady calm. Not pride, not bitterness. Just the discipline of a man who knew that honor was not for others to grant or take. Tomorrow he would march again. Tonight he carried silence like a shield. The video didn't sleep. By morning it had crawled out of Willow Creek and into feeds across the state, a shaky 38 seconds of flashing lights, a stiff-backed man in a black t-shirt and 2 Humvees rolling down Main Street like thunder with purpose. Parker's grill kept the TV on mute, captions racing across the bottom, while coffee hissed and plates clinked. Linda wiped a circle into the fogged window with her sleeve and watched the town watch itself. People pointed at the screen, murmured, shook their heads. They stared at the door as if the man from the video might walk in and steady the room. He did. Caleb entered quietly, bell above the door ringing once. He nodded to Linda, to the old couple at the counter, and sat in his usual corner back to the wall. He didn't glance at the TV. He didn't need to. Across the street, Sheriff Reynolds pinned a schedule to the station corkboard. Fort Myer training cycle. A cycle. B cycle. C. No excuses, no delays. A younger officer, Vargas, frowned. Sheriff, are we being punished? Reynolds smoothed the paper flat. No, we're being educated. Emily stood nearby. She caught Vargas's eye, her voice steady. It's worth it. You need to feel the marble under your boots. He looked away, but he heard her. By 9, a news van rolled into town. The camera crew set up by the courthouse, the reporter rehearsing her lines. Emily walked past, shoulders squared. Officer Carter, the reporter called. Can we get a comment? Emily stopped. She breathed once, then turned. I made a mistake last week, she said. The department is taking steps to learn. That's my comment. Do you feel targeted by the military response? No, she replied. I felt corrected by it. The reporter blinked, thrown. Michael stepped beside her like a shield. What about Sergeant Marshall? Will he talk? Michael shook his head. He doesn't owe anyone a soundbite. And they kept walking. At Fort Myer, Captain Bennett handled a call from Public Affairs. A colonel's aide worried the cemetery's silence was turning into spectacle. "We won't parade anyone," Bennett said. "We're building understanding, that's all. And the video?" "We didn't make it," she answered. "We won't amplify it. We'll do the work." She hung up and looked out the window toward the endless rows of white stone. Headlines would pass. The work remained. In the diner, Linda slid a mug onto Caleb's table. "On the house," she said. "Make it on mine," he answered. "For the next veteran who walks in. Or for someone who carries a weight nobody sees." Linda's eyes softened. "You've got a way with words, Caleb." He almost smiled. The bell rang again. An older woman entered, gray hair pinned back, shoes plain. She held a photograph close to her chest. Linda's voice gentled. "Morning, Ruth." Ruth nodded. She laid the photo on the counter, a young soldier, crisp uniform smile, forever 19. The edges were worn white from years of touch. Emily arrived moments later and paused at the sight. She approached carefully. "May I sit?" Ruth patted the stool beside her. "You may. I've had enough people stand over me." Emily sat, her eyes drawn to the photo. "Your son." "My boy," Ruth whispered. 19 when he left. Older than that when they told me they'd never find all of him. Emily's chest tightened. "I'm sorry. I saw your face on the news," Ruth said. "You looked like you'd swallowed a stone." "I have swallowed many." "I was wrong," Emily admitted. "I judged a man I didn't understand." Ruth traced the cracked corner of the photo. "We judge to keep from feeling too much. Then one day we feel anyway." Across the room, Caleb sat silent, listening without intruding. He recognized the timbre of grief. It shifted the air itself. He kept his eyes on his coffee, but respect radiated outward. Ruth's voice softened. "They say the tomb is guarded in rain and storm. They say the steps are counted like prayer beads. They say silence is its own language." "It is," Emily said. "I stood there last week. It spoke." "And what did it say?" Ruth asked. "That I am small," Emily whispered, "and that small is not an insult. It is how we measure honor." Ruth smiled faintly. "Then you heard it right." Sheriff Reynolds entered, hat in hand. He saw Ruth's photo sat quietly on her other side. "Ma'am," he said, "if you need anything, our office is here." "I have what I need," Ruth replied. "A place where they keep a promise." Reynolds nodded, eyes heavy. Linda, drying her hands, spoke without looking up. "Town council wants a statement." "Sheriff, they think this is a scandal." "We don't have a scandal," he said. "We have a lesson. Lessons don't sell, but they last longer." The bell rang again. Captain Bennett stepped inside, cap tucked under her arm. She went first to Ruth, bowing her head slightly. "Thank you for being here." "Thank you for not forgetting," Ruth answered. Then Bennett turned to Emily. "I watched the clip. You didn't make excuses. Keep it that way." "Yes, ma'am." Her final glance met Caleb's across the diner. No words, just respect exchanged in silence. Later on the sidewalk outside, Emily caught Caleb before he left. "Caleb," she said carefully, "when you march, what do you tell yourself to keep it from being about you?" He considered, then answered, "I don't tell myself anything. I listen. The marble says what it needs, the wind says the rest. If I hear my own name too loud, I start over." Emily nodded, her eyes wet but steady. "I think I've been listening to my own name too long." "Then lower the volume," Caleb said simply. A truck rattled past. The driver raised 2 fingers from the wheel. Caleb returned the gesture, plain and unceremonious. And the town, small as it was, began to breathe differently. The air over Arlington carried a weight of its own that day. Clouds rolled low, heavy with unshed rain, as though the sky itself prepared for witness. At the Tomb Plaza, tourists gathered with murmured reverence. Their chatter softened when the sentinel's heel plates struck marble in crisp rhythm. 21 steps, a pause. A turn, another 21 seconds. It was ritual. It was discipline. It was the language of silence. Among the visitors stood a cluster of Willow Creek officers. Their uniforms pressed their eyes, uncharacteristically focused. Sheriff Reynolds led them, hands behind his back, posture stiffer than usual. Emily Carter stood in the front row, her sunglasses gone, her expression stripped bare. Michael Hayes hovered beside her, uncertain but intent. Captain Bennett moved among them like a conductor guiding an orchestra into stillness. She pointed subtly to details, the white gloves catching light, the perfect rifle angle, the pivot sharp enough to slice air. Each gesture was explanation without words. This is why discipline matters. This is why respect is non-negotiable. As the guard change began, the crowd rose almost as one. Phones lowered. Parents whispered to their children to be still. The officers from Willow Creek found themselves holding their breath, not because they were told, but because reverence demanded it. When the relief sentinel took position, Bennett leaned toward Reynolds. Now she whispered. He nodded. Emily stepped forward, boots clicking lightly against the stone. She turned to face her peers, her chest tight, her throat burning. She had spoken at the station, but this was different. Here the air pressed her words into permanence. She drew a breath. Last week I stopped a man. I saw rust and fabric and thought I knew everything. I thought my badge gave me certainty. It gave me blindness instead. The officer shifted, listening. Tourists lingered at the edges, drawn to her trembling voice. Emily continued louder now. I disrespected someone who carried honor heavier than any badge I will ever wear. And I learned something here. Watching this silent service isn't about control. It's about sacrifice. It's about walking when no one thanks you, standing when no one notices. I failed to see that. Her voice broke. She pressed her palms together, once grounding herself. I don't ask you to forget what I did. I ask you to remember it so none of us repeat it. That is how we honor the people who gave everything. That is how we honor each other. For a long time, no one moved. Even the sentinel, in his slow, deliberate steps, seemed to carry her words like another weight on the plaza. Then Reynolds nodded solemn, and the officers followed suit. It wasn't applause. It was acknowledgement, the kind that lasted. Later in the training hall, Captain Bennett gathered the officers. She projected images across the screen, sentinels standing in hurricane's uniforms, soaked through, but still immaculate. Guards in the dead of night shadows stretching across marble. Funerals carried out with unbroken precision. This, she said, her voice firm, isn't performance. It's promise. The men and women who stand here commit to something larger than self. If you can't understand that, you can't serve in your own uniform either. Her gaze swept the room, catching Emily's steady eyes. Michael's thoughtful frown, Vargas's nervous shifting. Every time you stop someone, remember, they may carry more than you see. A badge, a scar, a story. You don't need to know it all. You only need to respect it. Silence answered her, a silence that felt less like discomfort and more like absorption. That evening, Caleb sat alone in his modest kitchen uniform, hanging pressed and perfect on the rack. He polished his shoes by lamplight, methodical, unhurried. The day had ended as all days ended, with preparation for the next watch. His phone buzzed once. A message from Bennett training, successful. Officers understood. You were right not to seek spotlight. Caleb set the phone down. He didn't need credit. He needed silence. But across town, in a modest apartment, Emily stared at her own reflection in the window. Her badge sat on the table beside her, catching stray light from a street lamp. She touched it once, fingertips hovering. For the first time, it didn't feel like armor. It felt like responsibility. The town felt the ripple. At Parker's Grill, Ruth returned with her photograph of her son. This time she didn't place it on the counter. She kept it in her lap hands, folded around it like prayer. Emily entered quietly and took the stool beside her. You came back, Ruth said. Yes, Emily answered. Did you listen? I listened, Emily said. And I'll keep listening. Ruth studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then maybe my boy's silence taught you too. Caleb entered minutes later, the bell jingling. He saw the two women side by side, the grieving mother, the officer learning humility, and for once he allowed himself the faintest smile. It wasn't joy. It was recognition that something broken might begin to heal. The following week, Captain Bennett and Sheriff Reynolds met again. This time, not in an office, but on the plaza itself. The sheriff held his hat against his chest. We'll keep the program going, he said. Not just for Willow Creek. Other departments can benefit. Bennett nodded. Respect isn't regional, it's universal. They stood together as the sentinel marched, the marble echoing beneath his boots. Both knew this wasn't about one mistake or one town. It was about the lesson carried forward. And somewhere behind them, unseen by the crowd, Caleb took his place once more. He adjusted his gloves, straightened his cover, and stepped into silence. The world could rage, cameras could spin stories, but the marble beneath his feet remained. And so did he. Rain swept in over Willow Creek with the kind of persistence that soaked through roofs, gutters, and bones alike. The storm had been building for hours, pressing heavy clouds across the ridges until the sky broke. Streets shimmered beneath the downpour, neon signs of diners and gas stations bending in the watery glass. Inside Parker's Grill, the storm pressed at the windows but didn't enter. The diner was warm, the air thick with the smell of coffee, bacon grease, and wet coats hanging by the door. Caleb sat in his corner booth, a book unopened on the table, a mug steaming before him. He hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. His eyes rested on the rain's rhythm, the way drops ran into lines and lines into rivers. Across the diner, Emily Carter hesitated at the door. She wore civilian clothes for once, no badge, no belt, no armor. She carried only herself, which felt heavier than the rain. Linda Parker waved her in with a knowing look, sliding another mug onto the counter before Emily asked. Emily crossed the room, pulled the chair opposite Caleb, and sat. For a moment she said nothing, just listened to rain and silverware and the faint hum of a jukebox caught between stations. Caleb finally lifted his gaze. "Evening, officer." "Emily," she corrected softly. "Emily, then." She wrapped her hands around the mug Linda had set down, its heat seeping into cold fingers. "Do you ever feel—" Watched Caleb tilted his head. "Always. It's part of the duty, eyes on you waiting for a slip, silence judging you louder than words." Why Emily shrugged. "Lately it feels like the whole town watches me, not with trust, not with respect, with expectation. Like they're waiting to see if I fail again." Caleb sipped his coffee, letting the words breathe. Then don't fail." She laughed, but it broke quickly into something closer to a sob. "It's not that simple." "It is," he replied. "Not easy, but simple. Fail less today than you did yesterday. That's all discipline is. One step, then another, even in the rain." Emily leaned back, closing her eyes, hearing the echo of his words against the marble plaza in her memory. She opened them again. "I spoke at the station. I spoke at the tomb. But words fade. People forget. Not if you live them," Caleb said. "Words carry only as far as you walk them." Silence pressed in again. Rain hammered harder on the windows, wind rattling the diner's sign. Linda broke the tension, wiping her hands on a rag. "You two want pie." "Nothing softens the edge of a storm like pie." Emily smiled faintly. Caleb gave a small nod. And pie arrived warm, flaky, as if to remind them that storms could be weathered with sugar and cinnamon, too. The next day the storm gone, but puddles wide as mirrors. Willow Creek buzzed with its new identity. People no longer said traffic stop. They said the Tomb Guard incident, and though the story had spread online here in town, it carried sharper edges. At the station, Sheriff Reynolds gathered his deputies once more. "We start the Fort Myers cycle tomorrow. Groups of 5, 1 day each. There are no opt-outs. This is not punishment. This is foundation." Vargas raised his hand timidly. "Sheriff, is Sergeant Marshall going to be part of the training?" "No," Reynolds said firmly. "He doesn't want a spotlight, and we're not going to drag him into one. He does his duty. We'll do ours." Michael Hayes shifted, then spoke up. "But maybe we should hear from him, even once. Hearing it from Captain Bennett is one thing." "Hearing it from him—" Emily cut in, voice steady. "No. He already spoke. Every step he takes speaks. Our job isn't to demand more of his voice. Our job is to listen better." The room went quiet. Reynolds gave a single nod. Meanwhile, at Fort Myer, Captain Bennett prepared the training ground. She walked the plaza with an NCO, noting where officers would stand, what they would hear. "They need to feel the cadence in their bones," she said. "Not just watch. Not just nod. Feel it." The NCO nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Bennett's gaze lingered on the white marble glowing under late afternoon light. Rain had scrubbed it clean, and in the sheen of its surface she saw her own reflection. She thought of Caleb, of his quiet insistence on silence over spectacle, and she felt both pride and caution. He was right. Their lesson wasn't his burden. That night, Emily sat at her small kitchen table badge on the wood before her. She turned it slowly light, catching each engraved line. Her apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the fridge. She whispered to herself, almost afraid to speak it aloud. Respect first, judgment last. She said it again. A litany. A vow. Across town, Caleb prepared for another shift. He polished his shoes, straightened his uniform, checked each seam. His hands moved from memory ritual as natural as breath. When he placed the badge on his chest, it caught the lamplight a gleam sharp as memory. He looked once at the mirror. Not at himself. At the uniform. The promise. He left without a sound. By morning, Willow Creek's first group of officers stood at Fort Myer boots on marble hearts, thudding with something they hadn't expected. Silence pressed them not as emptiness, but as weight. The sentinel moved each step deliberate. The officers shifted uncomfortably, unused to standing still this long, unused to reverence that demanded more than words. Emily, though not in this group, watched from a distance. She saw the shifting, the impatience, and she saw the way it melted slowly into something else, humility. The silence was winning. Bennett's voice cut through quietly but firmly. This is what you owe. This stillness. This respect. Don't lose it when you leave this plaza. And as the guard changed, the echo of boots on stone reminded them all the discipline was endless. That evening, Caleb returned to Parker's Grill uniform, still sharp shoes, still gleaming despite the rain puddles outside. He sat in his corner booth, ordered black coffee, and nodded when Linda set it down. Across the room, Emily watched him from her own table, not out of obligation, but out of something newer, gratitude. For the first time since the flashing lights on Main Street, she allowed herself to breathe without weight pressing down. She had been corrected, yes, but she had also been changed. The summer heat returned to Willow Creek as though the storm had never touched it, the streets drying into a brittle shimmer of sunlight and dust. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of the town, something had shifted. People no longer whispered only of scandal or shame. They spoke of lessons of humility of a soldier whose silence carried more power than any shouting. Caleb felt none of it directly. He didn't read the post, didn't watch the shaky videos. He simply moved with the same rhythm as always, early mornings, quiet rituals. Boots, polished uniform, pressed silence, observed. The marble beneath his steps was unchanged, and so was he. But the world around him began to move differently. At the police station, Sheriff Reynolds called Emily into his office. The blinds were half drawn, the desk stacked with reports, the air conditioner rattling in the corner. He leaned back in his chair, studying her like a teacher gauging a student who had stumbled but returned with new intent. "You've been the center of attention these last few weeks," Reynolds said. "Not for the right reasons, but I've seen you take it on the chin, and I've seen you step up. That's worth something." Emily sat straighter, waiting. "I need you to do more," Reynolds said. "Not just learn, lead. You made the mistake in public. Now make the correction in public." Her throat tightened. "How you'll be part of the training cycle," he said. "Not as an observer, as a voice. Captain Bennett wants officers to hear from their own. You'll tell them what you learned, not sugar-coated." Emily's heart beat fast. Part of her recoiled, standing up again, admitting failure again. But another part of her, the part softened by Caleb's calm gaze and Ruth's broken photograph, knew this was the path forward. "Yes, Sheriff," she said. "I'll do it." Meanwhile, at Parker's Grill, Linda Parker watched the ebb and flow of customers, the way every story in town found its way to her counter. A young man, college-aged, leaned across the formica, his voice low. "You really think that guy Caleb deserves all this attention?" He didn't even say much, just stood there. Linda set down his plate with more force than necessary. Sometimes standing says more than shouting. That man has given more in silence than most of us give in a lifetime. Don't mistake quiet for empty. The young man flushed, muttered a half apology, and turned back to his food. From his booth in the corner, Caleb overheard but didn't react. He stirred his coffee slowly, eyes distant as though fixed on something beyond the diner walls. The first group of Willow Creek officers returned from Fort Myer training changed in small but visible ways. Vargas, once dismissive, now walked into the station slower, more measured, as if carrying invisible weight. Another officer, Harper, polished his badge with unusual care. They spoke less of quotas and more of respect. Michael Hayes leaned against his cruiser one evening, catching Emily as she stepped out. "Never thought I'd see Vargas quiet," he said with a half-smile. "Silence does that to people," Emily replied. "Sometimes it teaches what words can't." Michael nodded. "And sometimes one man standing calm in front of a crowd teaches more than a whole academy." They both thought of Caleb, but didn't say his name. Some names carried their own echo. That evening, Emily walked through the neighborhood near Caleb's modest house. She wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a simple shirt. She found him outside leaning over his Dodge Ram hand stained with oil as he worked on the engine. She approached cautiously. "Evening." He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, regarding her with steady eyes. "Emily," he said, "I wanted to thank you again," she began. "Not just for accepting my apology, but for the lesson. You could have humiliated me that day. You could have pushed back, but you didn't. You stayed calm." Why Caleb looked down at the truck's engine, then back at her. Because anger proves nothing. Silence proves everything. I didn't need to raise my voice to show you who I was. My badge already spoke. My posture spoke. My patience spoke. If you didn't hear it, that wasn't my failure. Emily swallowed hard. I hear it now. Caleb gave a faint nod, then returned to his work. Conversation ended, but lesson not forgotten. The next training cycle began. Emily stood in front of the new group of officers in Fort Myers briefing hall. Her palms sweated, but her voice carried steady. "I'm not here as your superior. I'm here as your warning," she said. "I disrespected a man who deserved more than I could see. I let pride blind me. Don't make my mistake. Every stop you make, every question you ask, it's a choice between judgment and dignity. Choose dignity, every time." The room was silent, her words landing heavy. For the first time, she felt the silence as Caleb must feel it, not as emptiness, but as acknowledgement. Captain Bennett watched from the back, arms crossed, approving. That night, Caleb returned to Arlington. The plaza gleamed under moonlight marble, glowing like bone in the darkness. He adjusted his gloves, rifle balanced at his shoulder, and stepped into position. 21 steps. Halt. Turn. 21 seconds. The rain of days past had scoured the stone clean, but its weight was eternal. In the crowd unseen by him, Emily watched once more. She stood at the edge, her hands folded, eyes fixed not on herself, but on the sentinel before her. She felt smaller and somehow freer. As Caleb pivoted, salute, perfect silence deeper than words wrapped around them both. The sun blazed down on Willow Creek a week later, the air thick with heat rising off blacktop, and the scent of tar from a road crew patching cracks on Main Street. The world might have looked ordinary, but under the surface, the town still carried the aftershocks of that summer evening when Humvees rumbled into their quiet streets. People moved differently now, more careful with words, more aware of eyes watching. At Parker's Grill, Linda leaned her elbows on the counter, flipping through the morning paper. The front page showed a grainy image of Caleb's back soldiers forming a corridor as he walked to his truck. The headline screamed more than the story told honor defended in small-town clash. She sighed, folded it, and slid it beneath the counter. She preferred her own memories to someone else's spin. The bell jingled. Michael Hayes walked in uniform, jacket, unbuttoned hair, damp with sweat. He looked tired, but lighter somehow, as though a burden had shifted. "Coffee, Linda," he said, dropping onto a stool. "Rough morning." He chuckled. "Rough week. Training's changing the way we all move. Reynolds is pushing hard. Carter's speeches are getting around." Linda poured his mug, raising a brow. "And you? Are you listening?" Michael took a sip, winced at the heat, then nodded. "I am, more than I ever did before." Meanwhile, Emily Carter stood on the courthouse steps giving a brief statement to local press. She wore her uniform clean, her voice steady. "What happened weeks ago was my mistake," she said. "But I've learned. We all have. And the training at Fort Myers isn't just about soldiers. It's about service. It's about respect. That's what I'll carry into every stop I make from here on." Cameras clicked. Reporters scribbled. She didn't flinch this time. The words weren't rehearsed, they were lived. Across the street, Ruth watched silently, her son's photo tucked into her purse. When Emily descended the steps, Ruth touched her arm. "You sounded honest," she said. "I meant every word," Emily replied softly. "Good," Ruth whispered. Then my boy's silence wasn't wasted. That evening, Caleb drove his Dodge Ram down the quiet stretch of road toward his home. The sun melted behind the trees, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. His windows were down, the warm air carrying the faint smell of pine. For the first time in days, his body eased into the seat, as though the truck itself cradled him. When he pulled into his driveway, Emily's cruiser was parked at the curb. She stepped out, not in uniform, but in jeans and a plain shirt, her hair loose. She stood uncertainly, as though unsure whether to knock or retreat. Caleb killed the engine, climbed out, and faced her. Evening. Evening, she echoed. For a moment, they simply stood, cicadas buzzing in the trees. Finally, she gestured toward the house. I was hoping maybe we could talk. Over coffee. Off duty. Caleb studied her, then gave a small nod. I've got a pot just made. Inside the house was modest. A wooden table, walls lined with photographs. Most of them black and white images of the tomb of soldiers, in formation of the marble glowing in every season. A single picture of Caleb in uniform hung by the door, ramrod straight eyes, fixed on eternity. Emily sat at the table while Caleb poured 2 mugs. She studied the photos with quiet reverence. Why do you keep them here? She asked softly. They remind me it's not about me, he replied, setting the mugs down. It's about the ones who never came home. She traced the rim of her cup with her finger. When you stand there, when you march. What do you think about? Nothing, Caleb said. That's the point. Thought gets in the way. It's not about filling silence. It's about becoming silence. Emily let the words wash over her. I wish I'd known that sooner. You do now, Caleb answered. Outside, the cicadas sang louder, filling the summer night. Inside, the two of them sat in a small kitchen, coffee cooling between their hands, silence speaking louder than words. Later, as Emily left, she paused at the doorway. Thank you for not giving up on people like me. Caleb shook his head. It's not about giving up. It's about giving room to grow. She carried that with her into the night. The next day at Fort Myer, another group of officers arrived for training. This time, Caleb stood in the distance, unseen by most, watching from the shadows of the trees. He didn't speak, didn't step forward, but when the sentinel took his 21 measured paces, Caleb saw the officers' postures shift, their eyes sharpen, their silence deepen. He nodded once to himself, satisfied. The lesson was landing. Captain Bennett joined him quietly. You didn't need to be here, she said. I needed to see it, he replied. Do you regret staying silent that day? She asked. No, Caleb said firmly. Silence was the answer. The military showing up wasn't my doing, but it showed them what silence carries. Bennett smiled faintly. Sometimes silence speaks louder than a battalion. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. That evening, the sentinel marched again, marble, echoing beneath boots. The sun dipped low, the air cooling. In the crowd, tourists lowered their phones once more, sensing that some moments couldn't be captured, only carried. Among them stood Emily, off-duty, hands clasped in front of her. She didn't watch as a cop. She watched as a student. And for the first time, she felt she understood. The August sun lingered late over Willow Creek, bleeding orange light across rooftops and casting long shadows that seemed to stretch the day further than it wanted to go. Life in town pressed forward. Kids on bicycles raced down cracked sidewalks. Dogs barked from porches and shopkeepers swept dust from doorways. But beneath it all, people still carried the echo of that day when a soldier's silence drew soldiers to their streets. Caleb carried none of the noise. His evenings were as disciplined as his mornings. He returned from Fort Myer, removed his uniform, carefully placed each piece in its place, and polished his shoes until the leather reflected lamplight. To outsiders, it might have seemed obsessive, but to him it was a tether, a reminder that discipline wasn't about ceremony, it was about honoring promises. At Parker's Grill, Linda Parker listened as 2 men at the counter argued over what really mattered. Respect one insisted, stabbing his fork into pie. That's what we need more of. Respect the other scoffed. Respect doesn't pay the bills. What good's all that silence when the world's burning? Linda poured coffee for both, her voice calm but cutting. Respect is what keeps the world from burning faster. Don't mistake quiet for useless. The men lowered their voices, chastened. From his corner booth, Caleb overheard but said nothing. He didn't need to defend silence, it had already defended itself. Emily Carter entered not long after, uniform, crisp hair pinned back. She paused when she saw Caleb, then crossed the room deliberately. She stopped at his table, asking with a glance before sliding into the seat across from him. "Long shift?" he asked. She nodded, loosening her collar. "But better. Different. I listen more. People feel it. Conversations don't turn as sharp." "That's good," Caleb said. "I spoke at training again today," she continued. "Told them my mistake wasn't just about you, it was about me, my pride, my blindness. I told them if they carry their badge like a weapon, they'll lose sight of its purpose. And how did they take it?" Some nodded, some looked away, but I think they heard me. Caleb sipped his coffee, gaze steady. "Hearing is easy, living it is harder." "I know," she said, "but I'm trying." He gave a faint nod. "Then you're already different from who you were." Later that night, Emily found herself parked outside Caleb's house again. She hadn't planned it, hadn't even realized where her driving had taken her, until she saw the old Dodge Ram in the driveway. She sat in her cruiser lights, off wrestling with herself. When Caleb stepped outside, rag in hand, wiping grease from his fingers, he spotted her. Instead of annoyance, his face showed mild curiosity. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked as she rolled down the window. "Couldn't think straight," she admitted. "I keep replaying that day. The way I spoke, the way I looked at you. Makes me sick." Caleb leaned against his truck, folding the rag. "Then stop replaying, learn from it, carry it forward. That's all there is." She shook her head. "How do you do that? How do you carry the weight of silence without letting it crush you?" He thought for a moment. "You don't carry silence. You let it carry you. You stop trying to fill every space with noise, every gap with authority. Silence holds more than words ever could." Emily swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I want to learn that." "Then practice," he said. "Every day. Just like drilling a step. Just like counting 21. At Fort Myer the next morning, Captain Bennett oversaw another cycle of Willow Creek officers. She watched Emily speak with increasing clarity, watched Michael step forward to admit his failures, watched even Vargas begin to soften. Afterward, Bennett pulled Emily aside. "You're doing good work," she said. Emily shook her head. "It's not my work. It's his. I'm just carrying the echo." "Echoes matter," Bennett replied. "Sometimes they last longer than the original sound." Meanwhile, Caleb walked the plaza again, rifle-balanced, uniform flawless. Tourists shifted, children silenced by the gravity they couldn't explain. Each step echoed against stone polished by generations. He pivoted, saluted, and began again as he always did. In the crowd, unnoticed, Ruth stood with her son's photograph tucked into her purse. She didn't hold it out this time. She didn't need to. She watched the sentinel march and felt her boy's silence carried in each step. Tears touched her cheeks, but she smiled. And behind her, Emily watched, two shoulders squared, eyes steady, not as a cop seeking redemption, as a person seeking respect. When Caleb's shift ended, he walked past without acknowledgement, as tradition demanded. But as he passed, Ruth whispered under her breath, "Thank you." And though Caleb never turned, she knew he heard. That night in Willow Creek, the town finally seemed to exhale. The argument at the counter, the sideways glances, the suspicion all softened. People began to greet each other with a little more patience, a little more nodding before speaking. Linda wiped her counters clean and whispered to herself, "Maybe one man's silence really can change a town." She smiled, switched off the lights, and let the bell over the door ring its single clear note. The September air in Willow Creek carried the first breath of autumn, cool and sharp, slipping through open windows and rustling the tired leaves along the sidewalks. People walked slower in the evenings, jackets pulled a little tighter, conversations softer. Yet beneath that seasonal shift, the town still bore the memory of red and blue lights and olive-drab Humvees. It had become part of its fabric, a story woven into diner talk and late-night porch whispers. For Caleb, the change of season meant nothing different. Dawn still found him at the sink with coffee steaming in one hand, boots waiting to be laced on the floor beside him. He kept his rhythm the way the sentinel kept his 21 steps constant, measured, without compromise. At Parker's Grill, Linda polished the glass counter as Ruth entered, once more photo tucked in her purse, but not in her hands this time. She ordered tea instead of coffee, her smile faint but easier than before. Emily was already there off duty, seated at the far booth with papers spread before her. She looked up when Ruth approached. "May I sit?" Ruth asked. "Please," Emily said, gathering her things. They sat together, the silence between them no longer tense but companionable. Ruth sipped her tea. "You've been speaking a lot lately," she observed. Emily nodded. "Training sessions, community meetings. Reynolds has me telling my story over and over. And does it hurt every time?" Ruth asked. Emily paused. "It does, but maybe it should. Pain reminds me not to forget." Ruth gave a small, approving smile. "Good. My boy's silence hurt me too. Still does. But silence can shape us if we let it." Emily let the words settle. She had stopped resisting Ruth's lessons. She had begun to seek them. At the station, Reynolds prepared to roll out a broader program. Neighboring towns had asked about Fort Myer training, curious after the headlines. "If Willow Creek can learn, so can we," one chief had written. Reynolds took it seriously. He wanted no other department caught blind in arrogance. He called Emily into his office again. "You'll be traveling with me," he said. Her brows lifted. "Traveling. Sharing what you learned. Other towns need to hear it. They'll believe it more from you than from me." Emily's stomach twisted, but she nodded. "I'll do it." Meanwhile, Caleb remained untouched by press conferences and briefings. He spent his evenings in the same booth at Parker's, his mornings in quiet ritual, his shifts on the marble plaza. Yet even he couldn't escape ripples. Neighbors nodded to him more often, their eyes softer, respect unspoken but present. Children pointed at him in the diner, whispering to their parents, "That's him." He endured it with the same patience he gave the rain. Recognition meant little. Duty meant everything. One evening, Emily drove again to his house. She found him in the driveway polishing the Ram's headlights until they gleamed faintly in the twilight. "Caleb," she said, her voice careful. He looked up. "Emily, I need your advice." He waited. "I keep telling my story," she said, "over and over. I admit my mistake. I talk about dignity, respect, but I'm afraid I'm turning it into performance, like I'm selling redemption instead of living it. How do I keep it real?" Caleb leaned on the rag, considering. "By remembering it's not about you. It's about what people hear, not what you say. If they walk away respecting others more, then it's real. If they walk away thinking better of you, then you've lost the point." Emily swallowed. "That's hard to hear, but true." "Hard truths usually are," Caleb said. She gave a small smile. "You always know how to cut through noise." He shrugged. "Noise wastes time." The next morning, Caleb stood in uniform again, rifle balanced, eyes steady. The plaza was quiet, only a handful of visitors braving the early chill. Among them stood Ruth Emily and Sheriff Reynolds, silent but watchful. Caleb marched his 21, turned, paused, and marched again. His gloves caught the low-light white against the stone. Each step was as sharp as the first he ever took. Reynolds whispered to Emily, "That's what we were missing. We measured everything by control. He measures by constancy." Emily nodded, eyes fixed on Caleb. "Constancy, silence, respect. That's the lesson," Ruth murmured. "And it took my boy's absence to teach it." When the shift ended, Caleb walked past them as tradition demanded, eyes forward, expression unreadable. But as he passed, Emily whispered under her breath, "Thank you." He didn't pause, didn't look, but she felt as Ruth had once felt that he heard. That evening in Willow Creek, Parker's grill was filled with conversation. Neighbors debated town council decisions, road repairs, high school football. Yet beneath it all, a quiet acknowledgement hummed. Their town had changed, and the change had begun not with shouting or scandal, but with silence. Linda poured coffee for a tired trucker, her eyes catching Caleb in his booth, Emily at the counter. Ruth smiling faintly at her tea. She thought to herself, this town might just learn. She wiped the counter satisfied as rain began tapping softly at the windows. October brought sharper winds to Willow Creek, and with them a kind of clarity. The leaves along Main Street turned brittle gold and russet, curling at the edges like old photographs. The town had settled into its new rhythm, but echoes of that summer still clung. People spoke softer to strangers, now nodded a little longer before asking questions, and the officers carried themselves with restraint that hadn't been there months before. Captain Laura Bennett watched from a distance. She had returned to Fort Myer after the initial chaos, but her work with Willow Creek wasn't finished. She sat in her office one evening, light from a desk lamp warming the edges of a thick report. Training protocols, officer evaluations, feedback notes, all evidence of change. But Bennett knew change wasn't secured by paperwork. It was secured by repetition, by memory, by refusing to let silence slip back into noise. Sheriff Tom Reynolds drove to Fort Myer the following morning, hat resting on the passenger seat. His cruiser rolled past the cemetery gates, gravel crunching under tires. When he stepped out, the air was heavy with reverence, the kind that silences even footsteps. He found Bennett waiting by the parade field, crisp uniform cap tucked under her arm. "Sheriff," she greeted. "Captain," he returned. They shook hands. "I trust the cycles have been completed," Bennett asked. "Yes. Every officer in Willow Creek's been through the program," Reynolds said. "Some more stubborn than others, but they came out different." Bennett's expression softened. "Different is a start, but I want it to last." Reynolds nodded. "So do I. That's why I'm here. We need to make this more than a one-town lesson. Neighboring departments have been asking questions. They've seen the video, heard the story. They want to know how to avoid being the next cautionary tale." Bennett tilted her head, considering. "Then we scale it. A regional program. Start small, one county. Officers rotate through Fort Myer once a quarter. They learn discipline, silence, respect." And Carter Reynolds asked. "She should keep speaking," Bennett replied. "Not as penance, as witness. Her mistake gives her credibility. Officers need to hear from someone who failed and changed." Reynolds exhaled. "She's not going to like being dragged into the spotlight again." "She doesn't need to like it," Bennett said. "She needs to live it. And so do you, Sheriff. Leadership doesn't sit in comfort." Reynolds gave a thin smile. "You don't let anyone off easy, do you?" Captain Bennett's eyes flickered toward the marble rows stretching into the horizon. "Neither does duty." Back in Willow Creek, Emily sat at her kitchen table badge on the wood before her. Reynolds had just called telling her about the expanded program, about her new role. She stared at the badge, her reflection warped in its shine. Michael stopped by, knocking gently before stepping in. He saw her expression heavy with hesitation. "You don't want to do it," he guessed. Emily shook her head. "I don't want to stand up again and tell the world I was wrong. I've done it so many times already. Feels like I'm defined by my failure." Michael pulled out a chair, sat across from her. "Maybe. Or maybe you're defined by what you did after. Most people fail. Few own it. Fewer still turn it into something that changes others. That's who you are now." She looked at him uncertain, but his words landed. She tucked them away like a promise she might one day believe. At Parker's Grill that evening, Ruth returned with her son's photograph. This time she didn't place it on the counter. She placed it in Emily's hands. "Carry him with you," Ruth said. "When you speak, let him be your anchor. If your words falter, let his silence steady you." Emily's throat tightened. She looked at the young man in the photo, the crisp uniform, the grin frozen in time. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "No one deserves grace," Ruth replied softly. "That's why it matters." Across the room, Caleb sat in his usual booth, watching quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He knew the weight of what Ruth had just given. It was heavier than any medal. A week later, in a crowded training hall at Fort Myer, officers from 3 different towns gathered. Captain Bennett opened the session, voice firm, presence commanding. Then she stepped aside. Emily Carter walked to the front, Ruth's photograph tucked carefully in her notebook. Her voice wavered at first, but steadied as she spoke. "I am not here to tell you how to write citations or how to handle reports. I'm here to tell you how easy it is to forget the human being in front of you. I did, and it nearly cost me more than I can say. But I learned. Respect first, judgment last. Always." She paused, holding up the photograph. "This young man never came home. He doesn't get to tell his story. So we owe him and everyone like him the respect of listening before we judge." The room was silent. No coughs, no shifting chairs. Silence not of boredom, but of absorption. When she finished, Captain Bennett nodded once approval, plain. And in the back of the hall, unseen by most, Caleb stood. His posture was as steady as it had been on that roadside, on that marble, in every silence he had ever carried. He watched Emily bow her head, watched officers straighten in their seats, watched silence do its work again. He turned quietly and left without a word. That night the sentinel marched once more, boots striking marble in unbroken rhythm. The plaza was dark, the crowd small, but the silence as deep as ever. Caleb moved with the same constancy, the same patience, the same discipline. And far away in Willow Creek, people who had never set foot in Arlington felt the echo anyway. The chill of late autumn had begun to settle over Willow Creek, the kind of cold that nipped through jackets and made every breath visible. On Main Street, orange leaves skittered across cracked pavement, collecting in doorways and gutters. The town seemed quieter now, not out of fear, but out of something that felt closer to reverence. People had learned to measure their words, to give silence a chance to speak. At the police station, Sheriff Reynolds stood before his officers once again. This time the atmosphere was different, less defensive, more attentive. The room carried an almost classroom-like stillness. Reynolds scanned the faces, Carter Hayes, Vargas, Harper, and the rest. Their eyes didn't dart away this time. They were listening. Tomorrow, Reynolds announced, we'll begin hosting officers from other towns. Fort Myers' training program is expanding, and they'll be looking to us not as a mistake, but as an example of what change looks like. A murmur rippled through the room, some nervous, some proud. Emily Carter sat straight-backed, hands folded on her notebook. She had spoken enough times by now that her nerves no longer dominated her voice. Still, the weight of expectation pressed on her shoulders. Reynolds looked directly at her. Carter will continue to speak at these sessions, not because she has to, because she's lived the lesson. She's going to make sure nobody forgets it. Emily nodded once. Her eyes flickered briefly to Michael, who gave her a quiet nod of support. At Parker's Grill that evening, Linda noticed the change too. The diner was filled with conversation, but less sharp than it once was. People debated town issues with more patience, laughed more softly, and carried themselves with a subtle caution that hadn't existed months earlier. Ruth sat at her usual stool, her son's photograph tucked away in her purse. She wasn't showing it around anymore. She didn't need to. She carried it like a talisman, knowing its silence had already spoken through others. Emily entered this time in uniform, her posture firm but not stiff. She walked straight to Ruth. "Can I sit?" she asked. Ruth smiled faintly. "You may." Emily slid into the stool beside her. Linda poured them both coffee without asking. "I'm speaking again tomorrow," Emily admitted, "to officers from the next county over. I keep wondering if I'm the right one, if I'm repeating myself too much." Ruth sipped her coffee, her hands steady. Repetition is how we remember. Silence is how we hold it. Speak, then let the silence do its work. Emily nodded slowly, taking in the words as if they were scripture. That same evening, Caleb returned from Arlington Boots, still shining uniform pressed even after hours of wear. He entered the diner quietly, nodding to Linda, then to Ruth, then to Emily. He didn't ask to join them. He simply moved to his usual booth, coffee, waiting. But his presence alone seemed to anchor the room. Conversation softened, voices dropped. Respect radiated without demand. Emily glanced toward him, her voice quieter. "Do you think he knows how much he's changed this town?" Ruth shook her head. "He doesn't need to know. Change isn't for the one who begins it. It's for those who live after." The next day, the training hall at Fort Myers was filled with new uniforms. Officers from nearby counties filed in, curious but skeptical. Some carried folded arms, some muttered under their breath, but all sat when told. Captain Bennett opened the session with her usual precision, then gestured to Emily. Emily stood before them, hands gripping her notes, though she hardly looked at them. "I was you once," she began. "I thought my badge gave me certainty. I thought authority was the same as truth. And then I stopped a man who taught me without a word how wrong I was." She told them about the night in Willow Creek, about the old truck, about her assumptions. She told them about the badge she had mocked, the silence that had humbled her, and the convoy of soldiers who had arrived not to punish her, but to remind her what respect meant. And then she lifted Ruth's photograph, holding it so every officer could see. "This is why respect matters," she said, "because there are people who gave everything, and their families carry silence instead of stories. When we stop someone, we don't know what they carry. It could be grief. It could be honor. It could be both. Our duty is not to assume, our duty is to respect." Silence followed. Not the restless silence of skepticism, but the weighted silence of thought. Bennett stepped forward, voice low but clear. "That is why you're here. Learn it, live it, carry it." After the session, officers lingered in small groups, whispering not with sarcasm, but with contemplation. One younger deputy approached Emily, his face conflicted. "I've pulled people over and thought the same things you did," he admitted. "Rusty truck-tired clothes figured they were trouble. I never thought maybe they were carrying more than I could see." Emily nodded. "Then you've already learned the first part. The rest is living it." That night, Caleb stood again on the plaza, moonlight glinting on polished marble. The air was cold enough to sting his cheeks, but his posture never faltered. He marched, turned, saluted. And among the quiet crowd, Emily and Ruth watched together. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was enough. The November wind cut sharper now, stripping the last of the leaves from the trees that lined Willow Creek streets. Porch steps were littered with brittle fragments of gold and red, and shop windows filled with early holiday decorations, their cheer a fragile attempt to soften the season's chill. But beneath the garlands and lights, conversation still bent back toward the tomb guard, the convoy, and the lessons of silence. Sheriff Reynolds leaned against the podium in the police station's cramped briefing room, flipping through notes as the hum of the old heater filled the air. His officers, his own, and a few from neighboring towns sat clustered in folding chairs. Michael Hayes occupied the front row, hands clasped loosely, while Emily Carter sat just off center, eyes on her notebook. Reynolds began, "This department was humbled, but what matters is what we did after. We've trained, we've listened, and now we're asked to teach. That's a responsibility we can't take lightly." He paused, scanning the room. "Tomorrow, more officers arrive. They'll be looking to us, not to the Army, not to Captain Bennett. To us. They'll want to know if what we say matches how we live. Don't prove them right with speeches, prove them right with action." Emily lifted her head, her jaw tightening. She knew her turn would come again. And when it did, she would carry Ruth's photograph in her notebook, Caleb's silence in her memory. At Parker's Grill that evening, the diner buzzed with warmth against the cold outside. Linda Parker moved briskly behind the counter, pouring coffee, setting down plates, her silver hair catching the fluorescent lights. Ruth sat at her usual stool, hands folded calmly around her mug. Emily entered this time in plainclothes, hair loose around her shoulders. She spotted Ruth and slid into the seat beside her. "You'll be speaking tomorrow," Ruth said simply. "Yes," Emily admitted. "And I keep asking myself, what if I sound like I'm reciting, what if they think it's just performance?" Ruth stirred her tea slowly. "Performance fades. Lived truth lingers. If your words rise from where you bled, they'll hear it. Don't worry about eloquence. Worry about honesty." Emily breathed out, tension softening. "I'll try." From the corner booth, Caleb sat, as always, coffee before him. He didn't join, didn't interrupt. But when Ruth glanced over, Caleb gave a faint nod as though confirming her words. Emily caught it, held it like a quiet reassurance. The next morning, Fort Myers Hall filled again. Officers from 3 towns packed the rows, their expressions guarded, curious, skeptical. Captain Bennett opened with firm precision, her words crisp. Then she gestured toward Emily. Emily rose slowly, carrying Ruth's photograph tucked into her folder. She stood at the front, the weight of 100 eyes pressing against her. Her throat tightened, but she breathed once, twice, and began. "I used to believe my badge made me right," she said. "That authority meant truth. And then I stopped a man whose silence told me how wrong I was. I mocked his truck. I questioned his worth. I nearly cuffed him because I mistook calm for guilt. That man was Sergeant Caleb Marshall, a tomb guard." A ripple ran through the crowd, but Emily pressed on. "I didn't know what that badge meant. I didn't ask. I assumed. And my assumptions revealed more about me than about him. I was blind. But I learned. Respect isn't optional. It's the first duty. Every stop, every encounter, it begins with dignity." She held up Ruth's photograph, the young soldier's smile frozen in time. "This is someone's son. 19 when he left, never returned. His mother sits in my town. She carries silence heavier than any of us could bear. When I speak because he can't. When you act for people like him. That's the weight of our badge." The room stilled. No coughs, no shifting chairs, just silence pressed heavy on every shoulder. Emily lowered the photo, her voice softer now. "You don't have to make my mistake. You can learn now. You can choose respect first, always." After the session, Captain Bennett approached, her eyes steady. "You've grown into this," she said. Emily shook her head. I've only grown because others carried me there. She glanced toward Ruth, who stood at the back, tears glinting in her eyes. Grace is part of growth, Bennett replied quietly. That evening, Caleb stood once more on the marble plaza. The air was sharp frost edging the grass, the crowd huddled in coats. Yet silence stretched wide, broken only by the sentinel's boots striking stone. Among the crowd stood Emily Ruth and Sheriff Reynolds. None spoke. None needed to. They watched Caleb's 21 measured steps, his perfect turn, his salute. Emily whispered to herself so softly the wind nearly carried it away. Respect first, judgment last. Beside her, Ruth closed her eyes and let the silence cradle her grief. And Caleb marched on as steady and constant as ever, carrying not only the unknowns but the lessons of a small town learning to listen. The first frost clung to Willow Creek's fields, a thin sheet of white glittering under the pale dawn. Smoke curled from chimneys, breath clouded in the air, and the town settled into its winter hush. But beneath the frost lay a tension that hadn't fully melted, an awareness that everything had changed since that summer day when soldiers rolled down Main Street to defend one of their own. Caleb rose early as always. His boots were already polished. His uniform pressed through his shift at the tomb would not begin until noon. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, the window fogging slightly with every exhale. His life hadn't shifted much, rituals remained, but the town around him swirled with the aftershocks of his silence. At the police station, Sheriff Reynolds briefed his officers again. The room was warmer than usual, steam rising from mugs, jackets draped over chairs. He pointed at a calendar pinned to the board. Next week, Fort Myer will send representatives here. Instead of us going there, they'll come to Willow Creek. Captain Bennett wants to see how far we've carried this lesson. And they'll be watching closely. A murmur rolled through the room. Vargas frowned. So they're testing us. Reynolds fixed him with a look. Not testing, trusting. They're trusting us to show we learned something worth sharing. Emily sat quietly, her notebook open. She didn't speak, didn't argue, but her presence itself steadied the room. Officers glanced her way and found no defensiveness there, only a reminder of what humility looked like when carried properly. Later that afternoon, Emily walked to Parker's Grill. She pushed open the door and found Ruth already there, her hands curled around her tea. Linda Parker moved easily behind the counter, the rhythm of her work as steady as Caleb's steps on marble. Sit, Ruth invited. Emily slid into the stool beside her. They'll be here next week, Emily said. The Army, watching us. I don't know if we're ready. Ruth's eyes softened. Readiness isn't about perfection. It's about honesty. If you carry dignity in your chest, they'll see it. You can't fake silence. Emily smiled faintly. You always know the words. No, Ruth whispered. I only know silence. Words are just the trail it leaves. From the corner booth, Caleb sat, as always, coffee steaming before him. He heard but didn't speak. His silence was confirmation enough. The week passed quickly. On Friday, the Fort Myer delegation arrived. Captain Bennett at the lead, 2 NCOs in sharp uniforms beside her. They stepped into the police station's briefing room, boots ringing against the tile. Every officer in Willow Creek stood straighter, postures stiff but respectful. Bennett scanned the room. We're not here to lecture, she said. We're here to listen. Show us what you've learned. Reynolds gestured toward Emily. She stood, palms damp, throat dry, but her voice carried steady. We've learned respect isn't optional, she said. That silence speaks louder than control. That every person carries more than we can see. And if we judge before we ask, we fail them and ourselves. The NCOs listened, arms crossed, but expressions softened. Bennett nodded once, approval, subtle but certain. After the session, Bennett asked Reynolds to step outside with her. The winter wind whipped at their coats. You've done good work, she said. Reynolds exhaled relief, warming his breath. Still a long way to go. There always will be, Bennett replied. Discipline isn't a destination. It's a path. That evening, Parker's Grill filled with warmth against the bitter cold outside. Locals crowded in, their laughter rising, their conversations gentler than before. Linda moved from table to table, refilling mugs, her apron dusted with flour. Ruth sat near the counter, Emily beside her, both women quieter than the crowd. Then the bell jingled. Caleb entered, uniform flawless, his boots still dusted with marble grit. Conversations lowered instinctively. Respect followed him like a shadow now. He took his booth. Emily rose after a moment and crossed to him. She didn't sit immediately, but stood waiting. "May I?" she asked softly. Caleb nodded. She sat her voice low. "They came today. Captain Bennett." They listened. They seemed satisfied. Caleb sipped his coffee, expression unreadable. "Then keep walking the path. Don't let satisfaction become complacency." Emily tilted her head. "Do you ever feel tired of carrying silence, of always being the example?" Caleb set down his mug. His eyes were steady, voice calm. "I don't carry silence. Silence carries me. That's the difference." Emily sat back, letting the weight of his words settle into her chest. Later that night, Caleb returned to Arlington. The moon hung cold and pale, the air biting. He adjusted his gloves rifle steady against his shoulder and stepped into his 21 measured paces. The crowd was sparse, only a handful of visitors wrapped in scarves and coats. Yet, as always, silence fell. Emily stood among them, Ruth at her side, both watching. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They watched Caleb move his constancy, a reminder that discipline doesn't bend with seasons. And when he pivoted, salute-perfect silence deepened, wrapping them all in its weight. In Willow Creek, far from the marble, Linda closed her diner for the night. She flipped the sign to close, turned off the lights, and whispered into the empty room. "Respect first, judgment last." The bell rang once as the door clicked shut, leaving only silence behind. Snow fell over Willow Creek in delicate sheets, softening the town's edges and silencing its usual rhythm. Tires hissed on slush boots, crunched on sidewalks, and shop windows glowed warm against the gray sky. The first real storm of winter had settled, turning rooftops white and draping Main Street in quiet. It felt as though the town itself was pausing, taking a breath. Caleb rose before dawn, as always. He shoveled his narrow driveway methodically, each scoop precise, as though even the act of clearing snow was an extension of his discipline. When the path was clean, he brushed frost from his Dodge Ram, the old truck stubborn but reliable, and brewed his coffee. The silence of morning wrapped around him like armor. At the police station, Sheriff Reynolds convened his officers once more. The briefing room was crowded, coats steaming as they dried near the heater. Officers from neighboring towns had gathered too, drawn by the story of Willow Creek's transformation. Reynolds stood at the front, his voice carrying weight. "We've been asked to host the next round of training right here. Captain Bennett will send her staff, but this town, this department will lead. People want to see if our lesson holds beyond headlines." Murmurs spread through the room. Michael Hayes leaned toward Emily. "We're not just students anymore. We're teachers." Emily nodded, though her chest tightened. She had spoken so many times, but the thought of leading others still unsettled her. She touched the notebook on her lap where Ruth's photograph rested between the pages, its edges worn from her hands. That evening, Parker's grill glowed with light against the snowy night. Locals crowded in, warming their hands on mugs of coffee and bowls of chili. Linda Parker moved briskly behind the counter, her apron smudged with flour, her silver hair shining in the neon glow. Emily sat at the counter beside Ruth, both women watching the door as it opened. Caleb entered, shaking snow from his coat, his boots leaving small puddles on the floor. He nodded to Linda, then to Ruth and Emily, and moved to his usual booth. Ruth leaned closer to Emily, her voice soft. "Next week when you speak again, remember this. Don't try to be perfect. Perfection is brittle. Honesty bends without breaking." Emily smiled faintly. "You always know what to say." Ruth shook her head. "I only know what silence has taught me." Across the room, Caleb lifted his coffee, meeting their eyes for a brief moment before lowering his gaze again. No words, no gestures, just acknowledgement. Days later, the training began. Officers from across the county filed into Willow Creek's small town hall, the space rearranged into rows of chairs. Captain Bennett sat quietly in the back, content to observe. Sheriff Reynolds opened with a short statement, then gestured toward Emily. She walked to the front, notebook in hand, heart thudding. She didn't glance at her notes. She didn't need to anymore. "I've told this story many times," she began, "but every time it feels new because the lesson isn't finished. I stopped a man who carried more dignity in silence than I had in authority. I mocked what I didn't understand. And I was corrected not with force, but with respect. That changed me. It can change you too." She lifted Ruth's photograph, holding it steady. This young man gave everything. His mother carries silence in place of his voice. And when we judge too quickly, we risk trampling that silence. Respect first, judgment last. Always. The officers were quiet, not from disinterest, but from weight. Silence filled the hall heavier than applause. When she finished, Bennett rose briefly. That is why you're here. Carry this forward, not as performance, as practice. That evening, Caleb walked his measured steps at the tomb. Snowflakes swirling through the air, catching on his uniform, but never breaking his rhythm. The marble gleamed under the glow of floodlights, each echo of his boots sharper in the frozen night. Among the bundled crowd, Emily stood once more, Ruth beside her. Their breath steamed in the cold, their eyes locked on Caleb's constancy. He did not look at them. He never broke tradition, but his silence wrapped around them like a cloak, steadying them against the winter wind. Emily whispered more to herself than to Ruth. If silence is a language, I think I'm finally learning it. Ruth's hand touched hers gently. Then, you've begun to understand my son. In Willow Creek, Parker's grill closed for the night. Linda wiped down the counters, the hum of the heater filling the empty space. She paused at the window, watching snow drift under the streetlight. She thought of Caleb, of Emily, of Ruth, of the way a small town had been reshaped not by speeches or sirens, but by silence. She whispered into the stillness, respect first, judgment last. The bell jingled once as she locked the door, leaving the diner dark, but the town changed. The year drew toward its close, winter tightening its grip on Willow Creek. Snowbanks lined the streets, children carved tunnels through drifts, and the courthouse clock chimed against crisp air that seemed to carry farther than in summer. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of a small town, something profound had taken root. A story once born of conflict had grown into a lesson that spread beyond borders, carried on voices, and in silence alike. Caleb felt none of the noise. His mornings remained the same: boots, polished, uniform pressed. Silence carried like a shield. He prepared for each shift as he always had, every detail checked, every motion deliberate. To him, the world's attention meant nothing. The marble beneath his steps was eternal, and his promise remained unchanged. At the police station, Sheriff Reynolds gathered his officers for the final briefing of the year. The room was quiet, the heater rattling steam curling from mugs. Reynolds rested both hands on the podium. "We've walked a long road these past months," he said. "From mistake to lesson. From lesson to practice. From practice to example. And now we've been asked to keep teaching. Departments from 2 more counties are coming in January. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about what we represent." He paused, looking directly at Emily. "And it's about who we've become. Not perfect, but accountable. And that's enough." Emily nodded once. Her badge gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like a weight pressing her down. It felt like a reminder to rise. That evening, Parker's grill was alive with warmth. Locals crowded into booths, jackets steaming near the heater, mugs clutched between cold hands. Linda Parker moved behind the counter with her usual grace, her silver hair glowing under the lights. Ruth sat at her familiar stool, her son's photograph tucked deep in her purse. She no longer needed to display it. Its silence had already spoken through the town. Emily sat beside her, listening more than speaking, her presence steady and quiet. The bell jingled. Caleb entered, snow dusting his shoulders, boots wet from the street. He nodded to Linda, then to Ruth, then to Emily, and moved to his corner booth. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Voices softened, laughter lowered. Respect followed him without demand. Emily rose after a long pause and walked to his table. She didn't ask this time. She sat across from him, folding her hands around her mug. "They asked me to speak again," she said softly. Caleb looked at her, expression steady. "Then speak." "I don't know if I have new words," she admitted. "Words don't need to be new," he replied. "They need to be true. Repetition is how discipline holds." Emily let the silence that followed settle into her chest. "I'll remember that." A week later, on the marble plaza of Arlington, Caleb marched once more. Snow fell in slow, delicate flakes, clinging to his uniform but never breaking his rhythm. 21 steps. Turn. 21 seconds. Salute. His constancy never wavered. In the crowd stood Emily Ruth Sheriff Reynolds and even Linda, who had closed the diner early to witness it at least once. They huddled in the cold breath clouding the air, eyes fixed on Caleb. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. When his shift ended, Caleb passed them without acknowledgement, as tradition required. But each of them felt the weight of his silence settle into their bones. A silence not of emptiness, but of promise. Ruth whispered to herself so softly the wind nearly carried it away. "My boy would have been proud." Emily closed her eyes, repeating the mantra that had reshaped her life. Respect first, judgment last. Back in Willow Creek, the town carried on. Kids played in the snow, couples argued over groceries, neighbors waved from porches. But something unseen threaded through it. All patience, humility, respect. The kind that lingered long after headlines faded. At Parker's Grill, Linda turned the sign to closed lights dimming. She whispered into the empty diner. One man's silence. One town's change. The bell rang once as the door shut, leaving the room dark. And in Arlington, under the pale moonlight, Caleb's steps echoed against marble, each one a prayer for the nameless, each one a lesson carried forward. In a world quick to judge one man's quiet strength, reminded us all, honor isn't loud, it's steady, it's constant, and it begins with respect. If you like the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more similar stories. Now click on the video on the screen to hear another story that is equally powerful and compelling, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that makes you question everything you know about duty and justice. Click on the video.